evening. Welcome, everyone. This is another series, another seminar in our Freedom School series. We want to again thank the Department of Africana Studies and the Auburn Avenue Research Library for working closely with the Department of Africana Studies to produce this Freedom School series. Again, we have been doing this series since last semester, and it is only getting better each time. And tonight we have a special guest, Dr. Jurée Capers, who is a political scientist that is currently in the Department of Public Management and Policy at Georgia State. So Dr. Jurée Capers is an associate professor in the Department of Public Management and Policy at Georgia State University. Her research focuses on social and racial equity at the intersection of public administration, policy implementation, and race and ethnic politics. She often combines organizational theories, representation, and bureaucratic politics research to explain the factors that influence bureaucrats' decision making and the implications of this process for historically marginalized populations. Additionally, her research explores the policy implications of ethnic diversity and bias within racial groups. Such research examines how and why African, Caribbean, and Afro-Latino immigrants differ from US-born Blacks in their decision-making, policy attitudes, and political experiences. Her research tends to center on social policy issues, particularly education. Currently, she is developing a multi-city project to examine how race, ethnicity, and immigrant status affect bureaucrats' responsiveness to newcomers and immigrants' political responses to such interactions. And this is what Dr. Capers will discuss tonight. She will look at immigration and immigration policy, and specifically immigration among Blacks. Her research has appeared in the American Review of Public Administration, the International Journal of Public Management, Politics, Groups, and Identities, Urban Review, and various other academic venues. Jurée has received fellowships for her scholarship on education policy and disparities among racial and ethnic groups, and she was named the 2009 and 2010 American Political Science Association Minority Fellow, as well as a University Diversity Fellow at Texas A&M, and a Race and Ethnic Studies Institute Fellow in 2013, and in 2012 to 2013, she was an American Education Research Association Dissertation Award grantee. Dr. Capers holds a PhD in political science from Texas A&M, and she is a 2008 graduate of Winthrop University. One thing Dr. Capers that is not in her bio is that me and Dr. Capers have a connection. So before I met Dr. Capers, I actually heard a lot about her, and apparently vice versa. She heard a lot about me as well. And so we both are graduates of Winthrop University. And we were about 4 years apart. I think you were a freshman when I was a senior. And we both were Ralph Bunche Fellows for the Summer Institute. And we both are from South Carolina. So we both went on to get PhDs outside of our state in political science. So we definitely have that connection. But without further ado, we're going to introduce you and welcome Dr. Capers.
All righty. Thank you so much, Dr. Bonnet Bailey, for that beautiful introduction. So she's being very kind. Actually, I'm the person who followed right behind her and tried to do everything that she did, including the place of employment. So here we are at Georgia State University. I am thrilled to share some of the research that Dr. Bonnet Bailey explained in that introduction. That's a part of a broader project to basically understand how are American institutions responding to the growing immigrant population in the US? And as Dr. Bonnet Bailey explained, my interest is in bureaucratic representation and bureaucratic agencies. And the reason that is because while governments, while elected officials may propose legislation and they may give us policies and laws and statutes, those things don't matter if people don't carry them out. And so a lot of my research focuses on the group of people, the bureaucrats that carry out all of those laws, policies, and statutes. So the research that I'm sharing today explores how that group of people in government, that is the bureaucrats, the workers of government, are responding to the changing demographics of the US. So let me get started. Let me get started. Let me share my screen. All righty, and hopefully you all are looking at my screen. I think we're there. And let's get started. So just as an overview, I want to show you what we're going to talk about and cover today. So I'm going to give you a background of the study, so you can understand why we're studying this and why we're focusing on Black immigrants. I'm going to introduce the specific research question of this study. I'm going to give you a framework understanding of how I think about this question, how I go about answering it. I'm going to explain the specific study that we do in this paper, and then we'll talk about the findings and what this means. And let me just also say, this project that I'm sharing with you all is done with a colleague at Penn State, Dr. Candace Watt-Smith, who is also a scholar of Black politics and an expert in Black immigrant politics as well. So why ask this question? Why study this? So few reasons. The US is changing a good bit. And there are a few things that are happening in changing the US. The first is that we are becoming an older nation. And that is to say, between 2010 and 2017, the median age increased from 37.2 to 38 years old. So basically, we're becoming a little older. The other thing that is changing in this graph shows is that we're becoming more diverse racially. We're becoming a more diverse nation. Last summer, for the first time, the census reported that the country's non-white child population exceeded the white population in ages 0 through 9. Now, what this means is that by the year 2045, the US population will look like this. And that is to say that we will become a majority minority country by 2045. Some of this growth and change will occur naturally, but a large portion of it is related to immigration patterns, particularly among Asian and Latinx communities. So who are we talking about and what does this really look like? So in 2016, there were about 44 million immigrants in the US. And immigrants make up about 14% of the US population. And the more, we're expecting more and more every year. So this growth will continue, and we're expected to have 78 million immigrants by 2065. So things are going to change a lot. But I focus on Black immigrants. So the research suggests that we're going to see a lot of change based on immigration, and they attribute it to the Latinx and Asian community. But Black immigrants also contribute to this growth. So why should we focus on the Black population? So as I mentioned these general trends, I want to point out that there are 47.4 million Black residents in the US. And Black people, as you can see from this chart, make up about 13% of the US population. And last year, that is, 2019, we added 1.2 million people to the Black population. So it's growing as well. Now, where did that growth come from? Well, again, it came from immigration. So of the 47 million Black people in the US, 4.2 are foreign-born Black people. So this means that Black immigrants make up about 10% of the Black population, and 8% of the Black population are second-generation immigrants. And so what that essentially means is that about 18% of the Black population is either a first-generation immigrant or has ties to another home country through the second generation. So collectively, we're looking at about 18% of the Black population having some ties to another country. And as you can see from this chart, we've grown over time. We've seen this growth a lot, and we expect that by 2060, 16.5 we'll see about 16.5% more growth. So we will continue to see this growth, and Black immigrants will make up a major part of the Black population. So who are we talking about here? So I keep using the terminology Black immigrants. So who are we talking about? This group is pretty diverse, very, very diverse in terms of country of origin. 49% of the Black immigrants you can see on this chart are from the Caribbean, and that's mainly from Haiti and Jamaica. But a lot of the new migration is coming from continental Africa, and much of the recent growth is attributed to this population. So collectively, 39% of the foreign-born population comes from continental Africa. So here you're looking at the top 10 home countries of Black immigrants in the US. Black immigrants tend to live in large metro areas. So in some places in the US, they can make up over 25% of the Black population. So places like Boston and Miami, Minneapolis and Seattle come to mind. Now, as this group becomes bigger and it grows, and the diversity of the Black population grows with this immigration, we have to ask ourselves, what does this mean for Black politics? What does this mean for the American political system? And what will this mean for interactions with government? As you know, this is becoming a diverse group. And so that means that the things that we use to understand Black politics and to try to understand how Black people engage in politics may not hold as the group becomes more diverse and adds new people to the group. So that's sort of the premise of why study Black immigrants. Then finally, let me just point out that while Black immigrants often share some of the same interests and issues of the US born Black population, these newspaper headlines show that they also have some of their own interests. So this first headline about President Biden and deporting Black immigrants emphasizes the fact that Black immigrants have a unique experience of immigration that US born Blacks do not experience. And sometimes we tend to think of immigration not with the lens of Black immigrants, but of Latinx, of the Latinx community. And you can also see here that some of the same issues, again, that US born Blacks experience, foreign born Blacks experience as well, such as police brutality. But this final headline kind of tries to make light of a broader issue, and that is that Black immigrants and US born Blacks often share the same space and experience, but they are not the same people. And so sometimes there is some discord between the groups in terms of cultural experiences, cultural appropriation. And so that's why it's important for us to understand what's going on here, and trying to figure out how the government is responding to Black immigrants. Are they responding to them as people who are identified as Black in the US? Are they responding to them as immigrants, as outsiders, or someone else? Are they responding to them as a combination of the two? So that brings me to the research question of this research. And so the main research question of this particular study that I'm sharing with you all today is essentially, do Black bureaucrats represent Black immigrants in the same way that they represent US born Black clients? And we'll talk about why we're even looking for them to represent them in the first place in a second. So this is the central question. This is what's guiding this research. Now, the way I think about this question and seek to understand if and why Black bureaucrats might represent Black immigrants is through this concept called representative bureaucracy. So let me take a moment to be a little academic-y for a second to explain this. So this idea of representative bureaucracy actually originates in the English civil service by a scholar named Donald Kingsley. And what he essentially argued was that the demographic makeup of any civil service should look like the clients being served. Now, he came up with this concept in the 1940s in the English civil service. So he was really talking about having some more class diversity there. But when we apply this concept to the US, we began to say, you know, the US government's civil service, the bureaucrats, should look like the people that they're serving, right? It should be a little bit more diverse. And the notion here is that when the civil service or the bureaucracy looks like the people that they're serving, then people will be able to get their interests met, their demands met, and the bureaucracy will function in a more effective and efficient way, carrying out tasks with the interests of people in mind. So everyone has some representation. We should see better outcomes and better service delivery when it looks like the people that they're serving. This is particularly important. Representation is particularly important in the bureaucracy because they have to serve a diverse society, and they have to serve a lot of people from different racial backgrounds, gender backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, economic backgrounds. And so when we think about how government is doing its services, all of those things could affect how a person does their job. So this is why representation here is important. It basically helps pull in some additional support for when we don't necessarily have the elected representation we might seek. Now, so that's the basic premise of this idea of representative bureaucracy. Government should look like the people they serve in terms of providing services and goods. Bring this to the US, and scholars kind of teased it apart a little bit, and they began to say, you know, there's two ways we can think about this representative bureaucracy concept, and that's as something that's passive. So passive representation reflecting just, that is looking just like society. So the concept of passive representation suggests that agencies should hire to be descriptively reflective of the population or demographics. So we essentially look to see if the employees of an agency reflect the people that they're serving. And then the second type of representation, when they tease this concept out, is active representation. And this part is really where I like to think it gets important, or really matters, because it's the idea that not only should people be there that look like the population, the community that they serve, but they should be doing something. That is, they should use their position to represent the interests, needs, and demands of the people who they serve. And so active representation assumes that people will use their positions to press for the interests and desires of the people that they're representing. But this just doesn't happen just haphazardly or just because. There are a few things that have to be in place for this active representation, that is representation to really matter. There are some things that have to be in place. So there are 4 key conditions, and then I'll explain the other 2. And so the first condition is that bureaucrats have to recognize or press for the interests of the group. So it's not sufficient to just be there, but you have to actually recognize and understand and know what the interests are of the group. So this is where having a shared background, or having a shared experience, or having a shared culture comes into play and is beneficial, because you're more likely to know what the interests of the group are. The second condition that has to happen for this active concept of active representation to work is that the bureaucrats, or the people working in government, they have to hold a position of influence. So that is, they have to hold a position where they can actually make some decisions and affect change. So it's not sufficient, again, to just be there, but you have to be in a position where you get to make some decisions. Okay, so working at the lower levels of government may not be sufficient enough. The third thing is they must work in demographically salient agencies. And this is an interesting point, because it suggests that where it's most important to have representation is the places that provide a lot of service delivery, and that goods and services could be inequitably distributed. So in that case, we tend to think about representation in the bureaucracy in schools, in policing, and the social safety net services. So all of those things that are considered helping spaces is where we tend to think about these. And these we consider demographically salient, where our the benefits of having people there really have major implications for one's life standing. And then the fourth thing is that the policy issues of the agency must matter. So this is not to pick on any particular agency, But the issues that the agency handles have to have obvious ramifications for the agency's, for the bureaucrats' demographic group. So we tend to focus these questions in places, again, where we're looking at access to goods and services in an equitable fashion. We do less of this looking for it in, say, the Department of Interior, for example. If you're a fan of the Department of Interior, I apologize. But this is where we see goods and services really happening, and where we are able to trace our tax dollars. The final 2 points are some additional things that have been added over time. And that is, the first one, that the person has to perceive themselves as being an advocate of the group's needs or rights. And this means that the person, again, has to see themselves in a representative role. Okay, so maybe I'm there, but I don't necessarily see myself as a representative. I see myself as just a person who works here to get my check. Then the active representation just might not come from me. So that's what the 5th point means. And then the last one is that bureaucrats have to believe that helping their demographic group will not isolate or restrict or harm any other group. So it isn't a zero-sum game. So these are some of the things that have to be put in place for this concept of active representation, for representation to really matter. Now, for Black people, the research suggests that this really matters a good bit. And there's a host of research, particularly in education, that shows that when students have Black teachers, that they perform better on their standardized tests, that they are less likely to experience harsh disciplinary practices, so they're less likely to be suspended from school or be expelled, that students are more likely to be recommended for gifted education when they have a Black teacher. But we see this coming up for Black people also outside of school. So when there are human resource managers that are Black people are more likely to be hired. So we see greater access to employment when there's greater representation in HR positions. And when people have Black health, caseworkers, sometimes they get greater access or more information about public safety net benefits. When it comes to immigration and immigrant representation, though, the research is a little messier. And so we're not really sure if that happens for immigrants. So when we talk about Black immigrants, we might suggest that, okay, they might get some representation from their Black aspect, right, from their race, but their immigrant identity, we're not really sure if they get that. And so there is some research that tests this question in terms of immigrants overall, but the major restriction to see if there is a concept of immigrant representation is the fact that to work in government, you often have to be a citizen. So citizenship is a major barrier to immigrant representation. There aren't a lot of studies for that reason that explore this question, but there are some studies that look at this outside of the US, in France, for example, and finding some representation there, but not enough has been done in the US. So our study in particular points out that racial heterogeneity is an important factor to consider in this idea of representation, especially if our racial group is continuing to diversify via immigration. So here's the hook. We argue in our study that ethnicity, so having ethnic differences, may influence this representation concept. And that is that Black immigrants might respond, Black bureaucrats might respond in an interesting way, understanding that Black immigrants are a little different from US born Blacks. So how are we thinking about this? What's happening? So there are a few reasons why we think that Black bureaucrats might deviate from what the research suggests they would do. And the first is that all Black people don't think the same. So there is a good bit of research on Black heterogeneity. That is that Black people in the US and Black immigrants often have different ideas about social and economic issues, and they have social and economic differences. While Black is considered a monolithic group, really it should be thought of more of as a pan-ethnic group, kind of like we think about the Latinx community, because people are coming from different places and they have different backgrounds and different interests. So we don't all think the same. Because we have these different backgrounds, we don't all think the same. And as I mentioned in the beginning, this growth is diversifying the group. And so we shouldn't expect the group to be continued as a monolith. The second reason we think we might see something a little different here is that Black immigrants and US born Blacks have differences in their experiences. And that is to say, foreign born Blacks have come to the US through a different pathway than those who are born in the US, and they've spent varying lengths of time in the US. And that means that they did have different perceptions of American institutions and different experiences with American institutions like our bureaucratic agencies. So foreign-born Black people tend to be less likely to report experiences of racism or racial discrimination, and they're less likely to perceive discrimination as being a barrier to their success when we compare them to US-born Black people. Foreign-born Black people are also less likely to live in segregated communities. They're more likely to live in more integrated neighborhoods and report having fewer same race friends. So their experiences in the US are different. Their timeline in the US is different. Their experiences in the US are different. And so we think this difference might be important. The third thing, and most interesting probably to me as a political scientist, is that they have divergent political interests. So all Black people are not liberals, right? So and this is related to that different experiences. Native-born Black people, people born in the US, tend to be more supportive of a liberal ideology and see our bureaucratic agencies as a place for racial redress via our services. But Black immigrants don't always lean in this direction. In particular, they tend to think about spending less on the social safety net as a space for redress, and they're less likely to support high levels of social welfare spending and education spending. However, foreign-born Blacks are more likely, of course, to support less restrictive immigration policies. And this is something that the US-born Black people have an up and down relationship with. That is to say, on some instances, we argue that immigration is important, but it's not a more salient issue than issues that speak directly to our Black identity. Okay. And then the last thing I want to point out is that sometimes we don't all get along, that there are intragroup biases. So sometimes the two groups harbor ill feelings and hold stereotypes about each other. So for example, foreign-born Black people are known for holding this feeling of an elevated minority status. And this is where they try to attempt to only weakly identify as Black or a minority to improve their status in the racial hierarchy. For first generation Black immigrants, they're much more likely, the research suggests, to adopt stereotypes about US-born Black people that dominate the mainstream of America. But at the same time, US-born Black people are known to hold tenuous views about Black immigrants, especially when it comes to resource allocation. So for example, there is much debate about the fairness of allowing foreign-born Black students to take what's considered affirmative action spots at Ivy League colleges. And so given these issues and these differences, we make the argument that maybe Black bureaucrats see themselves as very distinct from Black immigrants, and they might not act on these representative ideas that representative bureaucracy suggests. But there is some literature that suggests that there are opportunities for Black immigrants and Black bureaucrats to align, and maybe Black bureaucrats will represent their interests. And the first is this concept of racial group consciousness. And the notion here is that race sits at the heart of Black's political decision-making. And so we tend to make decisions with the whole group in mind. And if Black bureaucrats are making decisions with the entire group in mind, that's going to include Black immigrants. So they're likely to engage in such behavior especially when the decisions have significant ramifications for that group. And the second reason we think that Black bureaucrats might look away from all of those differences that I outlined and represent Black immigrants is this concept of interethnic alliances. And so this is a type of group consciousness that plays out in racialized contexts to come where groups come together specifically when there is an injustice or to ensure that that there's an equitable distribution for the entire group. So we see this as kind of a conditional relationship. When there is a need to have the group act as a group, the groups come together. There are two scholars in particular who see this relationship for bureaucrats, for immigrants when it comes to immigrants specifically being excluded because of their immigrant identity. But that research is largely focused on the Latinx community. So in sum, given these ideas about racial group consciousness that Black bureaucrats think about the entire group, and that when they see necessary, they're likely to stand up for Black immigrants, we might see them look past all of those differences and represent them. But the last thing I want to point out is we have to consider that Black immigrants could possibly receive their bureaucratic representation outside of the boundaries of race because they have multiple salient overlapping identities. So Black immigrants often do not view African Americans as effective descriptive representatives in politics, and sometimes they prefer someone who shares their nationality, which is natural, or at least someone who has a more direct experience with immigration to represent them. So in that case, Black immigrants may also look to other immigrant groups to represent them. So we see this and think about this as representation through this multi-prism lens in which Black immigrants might actually be able to get some support through representation from Black bureaucrats, but they might also be able to get it from other demographic groups that share an experience of immigration. And in that case, we might see Latinx bureaucrats or Asian bureaucrats representing their interests. Now, to my knowledge, there isn't any research on assessing immigrant bureaucrats. Whoop. Those strange auto lights. There isn't research that really focuses on immigrant bureaucrats and if they're actively represent immigrants. So this is something that we hope to fix in the future. Second reason we might see immigrants coming to the aid of Black immigrants is that there's the idea that there is some inter-minority cooperation. And this suggests that as long as a person is in the minority group, then they're going to look out for other minorities. So the notion here is that representative actions are not a zero-sum game. So this means that in practice, Latinx or Asian bureaucrats could represent Black immigrants if the outcome of their actions don't take away from Latinx or Asian clients. So looking out for all minorities. And then the last thing that leads us to think Black immigrants might get their representation from someplace else is that they might experience what we consider a cross-ethnic or racial representation. And this is the expectation that other people will step up because they're there. So there is a suggestion that agencies change their response to their clients. So that is to say, as a bureaucratic agency comes into contact with more and more immigrants, they may also respond differently to those clients. And those clients may in turn respond differently to them. And so it has more of a collaborative relationship. And we see this in the past in terms of gender. So for example, when male police officers tend to do this when they work in precincts with more female officers. So we anticipate that non-Black bureaucrats may respond this way when they're working with immigrants. They may see that this group needs some extra support and they may step in. So given these ideas, we think that there's a third thing that could happen. That is that Black immigrants could get their representation from non-Black bureaucrats. All right. So taking all of this stuff together, what do we think is going to happen in this study? So we had 3 thoughts about what we thought would happen. And that is, first, that Black bureaucrats just won't represent Black immigrants for all of those reasons I outlined. That is, they don't have the same experiences, they don't have the same politics, they don't share the same interests, and they harbor ill feelings toward each other sometimes. The second thing we thought is, but maybe Black bureaucrats could come through and they'll ignore all of these differences and actually represent Black immigrants. And so here we thought maybe this group consciousness idea will kick in and Black bureaucrats will stand in the gap for Black immigrants. And then the third thing we thought is, or maybe Asian or Latinx bureaucrats will do it because they have this shared immigrant experience. And so they will stand in and represent Black immigrants based on that shared immigrant identity. And the additional caveat we thought is, but we probably won't see that coming from Latinx and Asian bureaucrats for US born Black students. So these are the things that we thought could happen in this study. So how do we answer this question? What did we do? To test our expectations, we use data from New York City Public Schools from school year 2006-2007 to 2015-2016. And what we did was we combined individual level data on the students and their demographics, their performance, so their performance on the state standardized tests, and then individual data on the demographics of the teachers there. This gave us about 13 million cases, but we only focused on the Black students in that data set. Let me take a moment to explain why we're looking at schools and teachers. So teachers are thought of as kind of the common bureaucrat in the country because they are government workers who are not elected, but responsible for executing one of the most important tasks of society, which is educating the masses. And so we use school districts to understand how the typical bureaucrat acts. So this gives us our first case study, so to speak, to explain what bureaucrats are doing and how they're responding to the diversity of the nation. So let me tell you a little bit more about this context of this study. So New York City School District is the largest school district in the US, and it is also the most diverse school district in the US. So you can see the sample suggests that Latinx students make up the largest population, and then Black students make up the second largest percentage of students in the New York City public school system. White and Asian students make up nearly equal percentages. The sample does have a multiracial and Native American student category, but these are less than 1%. So we don't show them here. We don't use them in our study. And then in terms of nationality, so percentage of students who are foreign born versus US born in our data set, about 15% of the students in our data set are foreign born. So this graph shows that as well. On average, this again suggests that New York City is one of the most diverse again, but has a pretty large immigrant population in terms of students. So every year they're getting about 12,000 students from the continent of Africa and the Caribbean. And then when we look within that foreign-born population, we can see some differences in terms of racial demographics as well. So again, Latinx students make up the largest foreign-born population or group in our data set, followed by Asian students, and Black students make up the third largest group. So about 17% of the foreign-born population in this data set in New York City public schools are Black. And then when it comes to the Black population, the bulk of the students are US-born Black students, but we do still get a sizable percentage of foreign-born Black students. So you'll see here that 10% of the students in that sample are foreign-born. And this is also consistent with what I said at the beginning about where we stand demographically in terms of the Black population. About 10% of the Black population is made up of foreign-born Blacks. So this looks pretty consistent with what we know about the US as a whole. All right, so that's who we're working with. So let me tell you what we did. So to figure out if this representation idea worked, what we did was we compared student outcomes and their likelihood of performing well on the state standardized test based on the race of their teacher. So we look to see if when a student has a Black teacher or non-Black teacher, do they perform at the top levels? That is, do they reach the advanced category in their standardized tests? And this is what we found. So what you're looking at are bar graphs for student performance on the English language arts test for the state of New York over the 10-year span. And these bar graphs show the likelihood that a student scores in the top category when they have one Black teacher, when they have a large percentage of Black teachers in their school, and then all over again collectively. If the bar graph is over 1, we consider that a success. Okay, so that's what that line means. The teal lines represent our foreign-born students, and the bright green represents the native-born students. So what you see here is that essentially when a Black student, both our foreign-born Black students and our US-born Black students has a Black teacher, they have a higher odds of scoring in that top performing category than when they do not. Okay, so way more likely to perform very well when they have a Black teacher. The same is true when they attend a school that has a sizable Black population. And here we're talking about Black teachers making up a larger proportion of their teaching staff. So for example, foreign-born students are 50% more likely to score in that top category when they are with a Black teacher. Okay. And so we continue to see the same thing on this side. This is just essentially a more sophisticated model, but it tells us the same thing. So here we're finding some evidence that that Black bureaucrats or Black teachers are representing Black immigrant students regardless of the differences. And this is for English. When we look at math, we continue to see those trends, though the bar graphs are a little different. So it suggests that the odds aren't as high, but we still find some support for what we expect, or that second expectation. So again, we see that when a foreign-born Black student has a Black teacher, they're more likely to perform in that highest performance category. So they're likely to really excel on their math assessment. And the same is for their US-born peers. And it only gets better when we add more Black teachers to their school. This third bar graph suggests that this did not work out like we expected. So this one is not significant. So we didn't find any difference. So this essentially says that it doesn't matter what the race of the teacher is when we look at this one in purple. But the last one suggests that it does matter. So overall, given that 3 of the 4 support what we're expecting, we continue to see that Black students are benefiting from having Black teachers, and foreign-born Black students are benefiting as well. And to an extent, a little bit more than their US-born peers. Now, the third thing that I want to share with you guys is when we test if Asian and Latinx bureaucrats are going to represent Black immigrants. And here you'll see a little bit more color. And that is because now the results are all over the place. So the green bars represent finding what we expect, or we hope are significant findings, and the purple and blue suggest that we don't find anything. And that essentially means that the Latinx teacher, for example, isn't any different from a non-Latinx teacher. So this first one tells us that foreign-born students don't get any representation from having a Latinx teacher. And the same happens here again. And then they don't get any representation either from having an Asian teacher. So in sum, having a Latinx teacher is not any benefit for foreign-born Black students. So their odds of scoring in that top ELA category, as hypothesized, is not what we would hope. And then the other one below the one suggests that actually they perform even lower. So they're sliding back with higher percentages of Latinx teachers. And then again, the Asian teachers, they don't have an effect either. Um, and um, and when we get in the percentages here, we also see negative relationships. Below one means it's negative, and that they're likely to see a decline. They're less likely to score in that top category if they have an Asian teacher. So what am I telling you? In sum, not working out so well for Latinx and Asian representation. And then when it comes to math, we see some similar trends as the English one. So having a Latinx teacher is not any different from having a non-Latinx teacher. So the students don't get any benefit, foreign-born students don't get any benefit from having that Latinx teacher. So we don't see representation here for math. And we don't see it when we increase the proportion as well. So that's what this purple bar means. On the other hand, native-born students, again, as you can see consistently, they don't fare any better. They're not really that different. So they're not getting the representation that we didn't anticipate for them to get anyway. And then when it comes to our Asian students, suggests that Black immigrant students have a slight advantage when having an Asian math teacher. So they have a 7% higher odds of scoring in that top category with an Asian teacher. But then when we increase the percentage of Asian teachers, that goes away. So a lot of moving parts here. So to simplify, what we get, this is what we find. When it comes to Black teachers, we're finding that there's a link. So Black immigrants are getting representation from Black bureaucrats. When it comes to immigrant representation from Latinx teachers or Asian teachers, largely we don't find anything. We only found something in the case of math. So what does all this mean? In sum, we found out that Black bureaucrats represent Black immigrants. So, and bringing it back to the initial question, how are these bureaucratic agencies responding to this demographic shift? At least in schools, we have some evidence that bureaucrats are responding positively to this shift. That is, they're still serving and representing students in a positive way. We also see that there's some differences in the substantive benefits. So as you probably noticed, the bar graph suggests that Black immigrant students are seeing even greater gains. They're higher likelihood of scoring in that top category when they have a Black teacher. And this is more so than their US born peers. And then the last thing to take away from this is that this concept of having an immigrant identity and a shared immigrant identity leading to some immigrant representation does not bode well. And we don't see that representation playing out. So while they may have similar immigrant experiences, that representation does not cross ethnic lines. So we'll continue to explore that, but that's the gist of this work. So thank you all for listening. Thank you for allowing me to share it. And I welcome questions and conversation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Capers. This was a very great presentation, very informative. I have learned a lot, and with that, I also have some questions that I would like to ask as well, but we will definitely open it up for audience questions first. Hold on, let me get my screen together so I can see. So one of the first questions that I have is from your last slide where you were talking about substantive benefits being greater for uh, non-native born or foreign born Black students that have Black teachers. And the question is this, I want to it's just based on Black immigrant students coming from majority Black nations. So, was there a way for you to identify the status of those foreign born Blacks? And I'm just thinking about this whole idea of racism and the impact that racism may have on Blacks in the United States versus those that are coming from majority Black nations. But also thinking about, because you're looking at education, the emphasis on education that may be different in
Mhm.
other countries.
Yeah. So in this study, we don't tease out country of origin. So we kind of collectively put all of the foreign-born Black students together. And so I don't know, for example, if being a Black immigrant coming from, say, Ghana is different from being a Black immigrant coming from England. All right, so I don't know that in this one, but the way that we figured out one's immigration status, our background in this study was to take everybody's birthplace of origin, which is how we constructed that variable. So there is an opportunity for us to continue to explore this. And in fact, our second study that we're starting to tease out right now tries to figure out if there is some representation in terms of like being Afro-Caribbean or being from a Black person from Latin America. We don't have a lot of Black people from European nations, but we are an African nation, but we do have a lot from African nations. So we're starting to really think about, what are the differences even within that Black immigrant category. So I'm excited to explore that question a bit more, and have an answer for you maybe in a year or so. And then the second part of your question is one of the limitations of this study is it's all secondary data. And so we don't get to assess, like students' response. So we don't know who's actually doing the work. So we make the assumption that it's the teacher doing the work and they're acting, but it could very well be the Black immigrant student doing the work and responding to that representation in a different way, right? And so given that emphasis on education and having a face that looks like them, even if it's not the same ethnicity, might prompt the student to do something. And we're not able to tease that out yet. And so Candace and I have really talked about this and sought some funding to help us really figure out, do some qualitative work or our own studies where we can pinpoint what's really happening here. Like, is it the bureaucrat or is it the client? And that's really one of these big questions that we're contending with right now too, because I mean, we want to know what the government is, how a government is responding, but in turn, we want to know how U.S. residents are responding to interactions with government too.
Yes. And so if we were to apply this to political representation, especially thinking about Congress or thinking about state legislators, do you think you will have the same findings?
Well, I think so, right? So some of our earliest Black representatives had roots outside of the US, right? So people love Shirley Chisholm, right? But Shirley Chisholm was a Black immigrant. Her family was not from the US. And so I think we have seen instances where this has been the case, that um, elected officials have had these roots and said, but I am still a Black American, right? So the same is for our vice president, right? She is a child of immigrants, right? And a Black immigrant. Same for our first Black president, but they still identify and represent or do their best to represent U.S. born Blacks and foreign born Blacks alike. So I think we would still see that, and we see it in both directions.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, when do you think more Black teachers and Black immigrant teachers will be accepted and recruited and hired in American public schools?
Hmm. Well, when do I think? I
Mhm.
think today, any day, right? Like there's a great demand. It's not a secret that the typical teacher is a middle-aged white woman. And so when would I think they would take it in any day, especially as we start to have this racial reckoning. And we have so much research that shows the benefits of having that representation in schools. I think the other half of that question, when will Black immigrant teachers be accepted? is interesting too, because I think that honestly, the institutions don't seem to see the difference. So in that sense, and in education, I think that Black immigrant teachers would be, for the role of teaching, would be represented and welcome. Now, in terms of maybe some experiences that may vary, but in terms of like accepting them to teach, absolutely. I think that would happen today ASAP.
Thank you. So one thing that I am wondering about is this whole idea you talk about the concept of group consciousness and the development of group consciousness. And so I'm wondering, how does that affect Black immigrants and their and representatives, and how they perceive their representatives? And so what I'm specifically thinking about um, is have you been able to look at generational differences in the data that you have? Because I'm thinking that the longer you are in the United States, the more socialized you become to adopt some of the racial views and racial attitudes that
Mhm,
are present in the
mhm,
United States. And so while you may have ethnic differences, you may eventually begin to look at yourself as, do you
mhm,
do and I may be wrong in this, do immigrants eventually begin to socialize under a Blackness umbrella
mhm.
versus a ethnic distinction?
Yeah, so not in this study. This study is just in school district, but some other work that Candace and I have done looks up at this a little bit, and what we find is exactly what you say, is that that second generation Black immigrants begin to hold policy attitudes and ideas that align more with U.S. born Blacks. So they are more likely to support more education spending. They are more supportive of affirmative action, right? They're more supportive um, of using the social safety net as racial redress. They're less supportive of the death penalty. And so our other study in politics, groups, and identity finds this, that there is a difference over time. So yeah, you're definitely onto something. So being in the U.S. and starting to get that socialization experience does help. But at the same time, there are still some cultural ties to one's immigrant identity. And so sometimes second, even third generation Black immigrants find themselves kind of in a tug of war in figuring out their place in Black politics and Black identity and ideology.
Okay. To kind of follow up with that, Ms. Boone asks, what are the key differences in perceptions between Native Blacks and Black immigrants about race and representation? So have you conducted any research on that? Or are you aware of any research that looks at racial attitudes among Blacks and Black immigrants?
So I haven't, so I'm a policy scholar, so I haven't studied racial attitudes in great detail. But my colleague who I do this research with, she does more of that work. And so her book, um, oh geez Louise, that's so embarrassing, I'm blanking on the name, but her book, Black Mosaic, explores this question to figure out, what are the racial attitudes and experiences of US born and foreign born Blacks. And in her book, she talks about how their attitudes do differ, and so I focus on the policy part, but she does talk about how Black immigrants tend to see racism not as such not as bad. Now I want to say not a bad thing, but not as bad. Tend to um, view the U.S. through a American dream lens, and so that often has implications for how they interact with other Blacks in the U.S. And how they engage with other racial groups as well. So I would highly encourage you to check out her book, Black Mosaic, because it's all about that, and then the political implications.
Thank you. Another question kind of along those lines was there a way to account for the Latinx or Asian teachers and their generational status? And I think you said you couldn't look at their generational status. Um,
Mm-mm.
but the person is asking, is it possible, because of the results that you had, that those individuals were socialized under white supremacy as well and possibly had a different view? of Black students, or
Mhm.
Black students had a different view of them.
Yeah,
Had
yeah,
it-
that's very, very likely, right? So again, we aren't able to tease the generational status, and so this is the the little secret of our study is that we actually don't, we're making an assumption that the teachers are all US born, but we actually don't know that. And that's one of the major weaknesses here. We try to get around that by considering just the immigrant population overall and the teaching in the US and New York City. And overall, the numbers are fairly small. And so we think that for the most part, the teachers are US born, but so that we're not able to do that. But that's another one of those things that we really want to be able to do, to ask more precise questions and get more precise answers with our own data, because this is secondary data, right? So we're working with whatever New York City schools can give us. And that's not to complain about it, because this is probably one of the few school districts that has this kind of data that allows us to do it, but it is a major limitation. You're right, that they could very much be socialized under that framework, and that might explain it.
Have you been able to look at any data in the Atlanta area?
I I have not outside of census data. I have definitely tried to apply for grant funding to study this question in Atlanta, because we're such a diverse, a diverse city. So Atlanta has cities now, Metro Atlanta has cities right now that are majority minority and rich with immigrant populations, like Clarkston and Doraville and Norcross and Duluth. And so I have definitely sought funding with no success yet to ask these questions, because this is a great test ground for figuring out these questions, and also seeing how people are interacting with local government, state government right here in Metro Atlanta, and what this means. So we have research, and here in the Andrew Young School, we really talk about what immigrants bring to the city in terms of the economy and economic benefits. But one of the weaknesses here as well is, like, what does this mean for their experiences? And so I am definitely hopeful that one day I will be able to do that kind of work.
Okay. And the final question, do you think the election of Donald Trump has had any impact on representation, Black representation? So we're thinking about, we're now seeing more um, people with immigrant status, like Ilhan Omar and AOC and others, in positions where they're representing large groups of people that are immigrant and Native people. So do you think that Trump, and of course the things that Trump has said about immigrant populations, so do you think his administration has had any impact on some of your questions or your research?
Research. Yeah, I think I don't know how it's affected the questions that the results, but it certainly made me think about asking this question, right? So we began this journey in 2017, and one of the reasons we asked this question was we were wondering, like, how are immigrants taking Donald Trump essentially? How are people who work for Donald Trump in bureaucratic agencies, how are they responding to what he's saying? And is this influencing how they're interacting and engaging with immigrants? And so that led us to sort of ask this big, broad question that we've been working on. And we've been thinking about this and starting to tease this out and propose research about that question, using that question by looking at it in different places, because we thought, well, some of them could be responding to Donald Trump, but some places have already been kind of going in this direction. And so we recognize that, say, the response to immigrants in Atlanta may be different from the response to immigrants in Wyoming, right? And so we see this coming up in electoral politics, right? The reason that we get our first Somali representative out of Minneapolis and out that area is because there's a large immigrant population, and now there is some there's a critical mass, but there's also some support there, right? And so we began to say, well, that area looks way different from someplace in North Dakota. And so that did prompt us to really think about those questions and think about where we want to expand this study. And I think to some extent, the election of Donald Trump did lead maybe some immigrant groups to get more involved, be more engaged, and to push back. There's some older Latino politics research that suggests that back in 2010 and in 2006, when states were pushing back against Latino immigrants, that Latinos began to get out and vote, and this is how they became known as, quote unquote, the sleeping giant. And so I think that overall, Donald Trump's rhetoric might have awoken some immigrant communities as well in that same way.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for your questions. Thank you, Dr. Capers, for a wonderful presentation. Again, we would like to thank the Auburn Avenue Research Library and the Department of Africana Studies at Georgia State University. And we would like to thank all of you who tuned in tonight to watch this presentation. As I said before, Dr. Capers is an associate professor at Georgia State University within the Andrew Young School. And next week, to talk about our next Freedom School series, we will hear from Dr. Goss and Miss Ashley Simon on race policing and disability. So they will be discussing race policing and disability. Again, thank you all for attending and have a wonderful night.
Thank you.